All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala ashraf al-anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, all praise is due to the Lord and guardian of the universe. And we send our peace and blessings upon all of the great prophets and messengers who have come before us, and especially upon our beloved messenger Muhammad, and upon his blessed family and his companions, and especially the women around him who believed in him, supported him, and struggled alongside him in the way of God. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Greetings of peace and blessings, my dear brothers and sisters. Thank you so much for being here today in this virtual space for what promises to be a really engaging conversation with our special guest, Princeton alum, Dr. Celene Ibrahim, on women and gender in the Qur'an. My name is Sabrina Mirza, and I have the great privilege of serving as the assistant to the Muslim Life Chaplain at Princeton, Imam Sahib Sultan, who directs the Muslim Life Program out of the Office of Religious Life. And on behalf of Imam Sahib Sultan and the Muslim Life Program, I want to warmly welcome you all. I know that for some, this might be the first time that you're attending one of our events. And so, and some of you are in fact from outside of the Princeton area. So we're very grateful for this technology that allows us to connect over time zones even. And we hope that this will be the first of many occasions that you will join us. I want to encourage you all to join our email list. I'll drop the link in the chat. It's also on our website, muslimlife.princeton.edu. And I want to invite you to stay connected with us on social media at Princeton MLP. And just before we begin with our program, I want to just say a little bit more about the Princeton Muslim Life Program for those of you who are new. This is a vibrant Muslim community that was built by Imam Sahib Sultan, the full-time Muslim chaplain on Princeton's campus, with the support of his wife Arshi, and over the years, countless volunteers from the community and the assistant who served before me, Sir Said. It's a community not just composed of students and faculty and staff on campus, but also the wider community. And so, for example, when we had Jummah in person, you would see young and old coming together, praying together, and having samosas afterwards. Because of university regulations, we've not been able to host in-person events. So this has been a very unique year with our programming being all virtual, which has its downsides, but it also has its upsides. Like I said earlier, we're grateful that more of you have been able to join. And we offer weekly programming that's open to the public. On Mondays, we have a peace meditation at noon. On Wednesdays, we have a Quran study circle at 5 p.m. It's a discussion and reflection-based study of Surah Al-Imran, the 3rd chapter in the Quran, with a line-by-line reading. On Fridays, we have a Jummah gathering at 1, which isn't a replacement for Jummah. It's just an opportunity for spiritual renewal and community connection, in which we have a student reciting Surah Kaf, and we have a spiritual address by Imam Sahib Sultan or a special guest lecturer. And we usually have a sister from the student or alumni or community that offers a communal supplication. And we usually close with a student who offers the call to prayer. So you're invited to join in all of those weekly programming. And in addition to that, we have on a regular basis events of this nature where we invite diverse individuals, from scholars to activists to artists. And just speaking, as a person who's been blessed to discover this community many years ago and just like fell in love with it, what personally drew me was the intellectually stimulating conversations that were hosted in an environment that really encouraged critical thinking and dialogue, as well as, the showcasing of art and talent within the Muslim community. And it's been a space that's really personally nurtured my own faith and spiritual growth. And I've always found it to be so warm and hospitable, and that's because of how Imam Sahib and Arshi are. If you know them, you know, and they teach by their example. And so the community itself is also a very beautiful community. I know I speak for everyone who's been blessed to meet our beloved Imam Sahib, that he's an incredible leader, someone who makes everyone feel loved and really energizes and encourages people to participate, students and community alike. And so you usually hear many different voices in our events, and he fosters this really loving brotherhood and sisterhood. So I'm so blessed to have experienced this, and I just want as well, this is getting long-winded, sorry, but I just want to invite you to be part of this community from a place of love, from a place of someone who's like really benefited and wishes for you that you also get to benefit that. And as many of you know, Imam Sohaib Sultan is struggling with a very aggressive and advanced cancer. So we pray for ease for him and his family, and that Allah blesses him and his family and rewards them and is pleased with them for all of the good work that they've done and all the hearts that they've touched. With that, I want to give you just a quick rundown of how the event will proceed. So I'll first turn it over to one of our students who will more formally introduce our speaker. We're so honored to have Dr. Celene Ibrahim with us. She'll offer a book talk for about a half hour or so on her book, Women and Gender in the Qur'an, which we encourage all of you to purchase. It's available most places like Barnes & Noble. After her talk, I'll invite 3 Princeton students to offer sort of like immediate responses and questions to which Dr. Celene will then respond. And then in the time remaining, we hope to open it up to the audience for any questions. So we look forward to hearing from you as well. And so with that, I turn it over now to our dear sister, Mina Mustafa, who's a junior here at Princeton, concentrating in the neuroscience department with a certificate in engineering biology. And she will more formally introduce Dr. Celene.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace upon you all. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Celene Ibrahim, who is a scholar, author, and educator. She is the author of Women and Gender in the Qur'an, and also the editor of One Nation, Indivisible, Seeking Liberty and Justice from the Pulpit to the Streets. Her current book project explores the concept of monotheism in the Qur'an, as well as Islamic intellectual history. As a trusted public voice on issues of religion and civic engagement, Dr. Ibrahim is deeply committed to counteracting bigotry and fostering values of pluralism, integrity, and civic responsibility. She offers lectures and workshops and also leads educational seminars to locations around the world. She holds a PhD in Arabic and Islamic civilizations, as well as a master's degree in Women's and Gender Studies and Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis University, and a Master of Divinity from Harvard University, and a bachelor's degree in Near Eastern Studies with highest honors from Princeton University. She's also a graduate of the United World College of the American West.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. What a special evening for me to be back here, not physically, but with all of you at my dear alma mater. And I want to again offer just a lot of gratitude to Imam Sultan and Sister Mirza for organizing this and for inviting me back. And I just ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give our beloved brother a full healing and to strengthen his family and really bless him and strengthen him in this process. Ya Allah, Ya Shafi. Alhamdulillah, I remember sitting as an undergraduate in Princeton and first discovering my passion for Islamic studies and spending much time in Firestone Library, just poring over the books in the library. So it's a real delight, and just I feel so much gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for now giving me a book on that shelf, inshallah. So I just wanted to start with a note encouraging all of you that when you feel those deep callings, those deep passions that are long-time goals that you know, set them for yourself, strive for them, inshallah, Allah will make them possible. So Jazakumullah khairan for coming out tonight. And I have a copy of the book here. I just thought I'd show you the front cover. It's a beautiful design. And I think tonight there's so much to talk about in a book, but I thought I'd start off talking a little bit about my motivations for writing this, because it sits at this interesting intersection between Quranic studies as it's pursued kind of in a Euro-American academic framework, and then our tradition of scholarship as Muslims and our ways of looking at the Qur'an and understanding the meanings of its verses. And so I situate myself in a field that it has become known as Muslima theology. And Muslima theology is essentially asking of the Qur'an and asking of our foundational sources, what in these sources is elevating and centering to women as a category, and also in thinking not just about women, but also of other marginalized groups, and really trying to understand from Islamic foundational sources and trying to really lift up what I like to think of as a female-centric perspective. So we have many centuries upon centuries of more of a male-centric perspective on, say, Quranic exegesis or other fields of Islamic learning. And so for me, the real challenge is to simultaneously situate myself in a lineage of Islamic scholarship and at the same time draw on methods from the Euro-American Academy to study texts and to understand history in light of the critical studies approach. And so this book is a merging of those two. And as you'll see, anyone who has opened it, it is in its way its own kind of tafsir work. And I use that word lightly. I call myself in the book a tentative mufassira, obviously mufassira being the female conjugation for a mufassir, an exegete. And I use the word tentative because, as you may have garnered reading my other books, I come to Islam fairly late in my life, in my 20s, right? I was not born a Muslim, and so I did not grow up in the same way, memorizing Qur'an and understanding the foundational sciences from a very young age. So I joke sometimes that in Muslim years, I'm just a teenager, and I take that very seriously when it comes to doing exegesis, because many of the great tafsir writers, by the time they reached the age that I converted to Islam, they had already mastered, libraries worth of information. So that's one aspect of this tentativeness. Also, this is not a line-by-line commentary, so it does differ in that respect. It's more of a thematic commentary, and I center female sexuality, female voices, female roles in family structures, and then women in sacred history. And I do the thematic approach because I find that when we read, and I'm looking mainly at stories and the narratives in the Qur'an that involve female figures. There has been a lot done in terms of verses that are fairly controversial, having to do with women in legal verses. And so I wanted to take my book in another route, in something that had not had in the same way a sustained amount of attention, at least from academic audiences, and really not from traditional Muslim scholars either, as far as I could tell, with the exception of just a few people in Islamic intellectual history whose work I engage with. Really, no one has, coming out of an Islamic intellectual tradition, prioritized in the same way these 300 or so verses that deal with women figures. And so I'd like to see myself as making this contribution to Quranic studies in some of my methods in the Euro-American Academy. But also this is really, it's a tafsir work of a particular kind. It's a thematic tafsir that takes as its start the verses of the Qur'an, and I do not go too much further into, for instance, those of you who are familiar with Islamic studies, I don't go into the Israeliyat, which are kind of biblically geared narrations coming to us from tafsir traditions and from other places that extrapolate the stories that are in the Qur'an. And so when I'm looking at the Qur'an, I am really taking a philological approach, but then also adding what I think is a real unique contribution in terms of Islamic studies, more of an affective contemporary dimension to it. So for instance, when I take the story of Zulaykha, for instance, I'm looking at that not merely in the way that previous commentators have discussed it, but I situate it in the framework of a sexual assault. And so I'm using in some instances very modern and contemporary terminology to understand what kinds of tropes and what kinds of ways the Qur'an is making commentary on issues that remain relevant in our lives today. And so, for instance, when we're thinking about the mother of Musa, may peace be upon her, alayha salam, throwing her child into the river to save him from a tyrant, we can think about that as not simply a story in our sacred history, but we can think of this as analogous to the experiences of women in our contemporary world who have to go to tremendous lengths to save and protect their children because where they're located is not safe in a political sense. So I'm trying not just to produce with this book a scholarly work, but I'm also trying to have it speak to Muslims in our contemporary world and through some of the questions about gender and sexuality that I know women have and Muslims more generally. And I highlight that part about, speaking to a contemporary Muslim audience, but in particular, trying to speak to Muslim women as being a voice from within the tradition that is engaging with these materials in a robust way. And with, I think, what I hope comes across in the book, a deep reverence for the Qur'an and the lessons that it imparts. And some of the things that I find, in taking this approach is that the Qur'an is incredibly responsive to women's needs. And so whether that's in Surah Al-Mujaddala, for instance, the 58th surah of the Qur'an, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying in the Qur'an, we have heard the cries of, the complaints of this woman, and, here's the resolution of her affair, condemning her husband for treating her unfairly. So that's an example of, lifting up the cause of women. But also we find verses that are the Qur'an acknowledging the cries of women and children who are mistreated. We find the Qur'an speaking to, for instance, the idea of responding in a very interesting way to the idea of original sin that comes out of the Christian tradition that places sort of the fall of humanity on the shoulders of a woman. So the Qur'an does not at all cast the story in that light. And in fact, when we look at Qur'anic verses that speak to and about the first couple, Adam and Hawa, we see that the couple is speaking in unison. We find that when they do tawbah, when they turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the words that Adam has received of tawbah, which is quite the essence of Islamic worship, this formula of tawbah, we find that the pair say these words in unison with each other. So we find that not only does the Qur'an not blame Hawa in a specific way, as we find narrated in our sister traditions, but we also find that the Qur'an gives Hawa a very active role in the Tawbah process. And so through highlighting all different instances like these, I show that overall the Qur'an has a very responsive position when it comes to voices of women. Another example we could give is that in the Qur'an, many of the female figures are praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in the chapter that I look at female speech, I point out that until we get, in fact, to Zulaykha and a good portion of the way into the Mus'haf, all of the verses that contain female speech are actually verses where women figures are making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and asking for particular needs in their life, or for instance, in the case of the mother of Maryam, alayhi salam, she's dedicating her unborn child to Allah's service. So we see on the whole, we see very pious women figures. We do not find any characteristic per se of women figures that differentiates them on a whole from male figures. So oftentimes when we see verses that are talking about the spiritual acumen of particular women figures or women in general, we find parallel verses that attribute the same characteristics to male figures. And contrary to maybe popular Muslim culture, we don't find women, for instance, being depicted as more or less chaste. We don't find women figures as being portrayed with more or less intellect. We find none of that when we look at the depictions of women in the Qur'an in comparison to the depictions of male figures in the Qur'an. And an example of this that I'll give that's pretty striking is that if we think of female modesty and chastity, of course, the figure of Maryam alayhi salam comes into our minds. But if we look very closely, Zachariah alayhi salam is also described as chaste in the Quran. And of course, they have a familial relationship. They're both living in the house of Yahya is described as being particularly chaste, and both Yahya alayhi salam and Maryam alayhi salam are living in the house of Zachariah. So they have a familial connection, and both are described as being particularly chaste in words that are not used to describe anyone else in the Quran. So it's fairly unique of the two of them, this particular characteristic as preserving their chastity. So that's just one example of many that I could give where women figures are attributed similar characteristics as male figures. In fact, the only difference that I could find as I looked across the female figures and the male figures is in the issue of public preaching. And I'm not sure what we make of this as a devotional audience approaching the Quran, but in contrast to the many male figures who are preaching to their people, we don't find any instances of women figures per se preaching to crowds of people. And that's really the only differentiation point that I found between women figures and male figures. I'm planning, I have a current book project, but after that book project, I'm looking at a companion to this particular book, inshallah, if Allah gives me the power and the ability, inshallah, called Men and Gender in the Quran. And I think this will really help, a volume like this will really help me put into language even further what are subtle differences between male figures and female figures in the Quran. But I don't find in vast sweeping characterizations, other than the point I just mentioned, I don't find differences. Other things to potentially mention are the placement of particular verses in the Mus'haf. So when I was doing my research of the Quran, I went in basically 3 different modalities. The first modality that I looked at is the arc of sacred history. And what I mean by that is, from Adam and Hawa all the way through the different prophetic families to the companions and the household of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in this arc, I find that even figures we don't necessarily think of as having families that are particularly prominent, when we look at the Mus'haf, we actually see that, in fact, they are mentioned with their families. And so I do quite a bit in the book to draw out all of these different women figures who surround, for instance, the Prophet Musa alayhi salam. And he has not only a mother who is mentioned in the Quran, but a foster mother, not only a sister, but a sister-in-law. And of course, we have an interesting way in which he meets his future wife in you know, and she's really the one to advocate for him to her father, you know, saying that she sees in him these qualities that would make him particularly good as an employee. And in this narration, we find that potentially she is also suggesting to her father the idea that she would like to marry him. So this is another interesting trope where we find not only families of prophets in sacred history coming to the fore, accompanying the prophets in their mission as prophets, whether that is kind of fleeing, as the family of Saleh has to do with you know, their patriarch, or we find it in the case of Musa alayhi salam, all of these women figures in his life that are saving him from calamities and enabling him to do the work of calling people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so I'm not ready to say that women figures primarily have supporting roles. That is certainly the case when we look at most figures. Most Quranic women figures have supporting roles in narratives and are maybe only mentioned in a few verses. The exception to that is obviously Maryam alayhi salam, whose name is featured 34 times in the Qur'an. As a side note, I also found 33, and potentially, if you count the laugh of Sarah, 34 verses in the Qur'an that contain women's speech. So that's just an interesting parallel that the number 34 comes up both in terms of the number of ayah and the number of times Maryam's name is mentioned. But we find, again, if we're looking at this arc, that there's also consistently women figures are in fact featured in sacred history. And so it would be a mistake to narrate our sacred history only from the lens of the patriarchs, because that would underplay the really important roles that women are you know, from the perspective of sacred history, are playing in having the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be able to reach the people. And as an illustration of this, I often turn to the beginning of Surah Al-Qasas, Surah Al-Qasas, which is number 28. And very much in the beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking about the social situation where people are being oppressed. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that he wanted to make those oppressed in the land the imams. This is right in the beginning of Surah Al-Qasas. And the very next verse after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is setting this up as there's tyranny in the land, it's actually, the next verse goes to the mother of Musa alayhi salam nursing this infant and being inspired, you know, using that word that's the same root as wahi, so inspiration or in its formal sense, revelation. Using this word, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspires a single woman, you know, who's, you know, with an infant child. And this is the impetus that flips the whole social order. So from this point, I just highlight that it's actually when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to improve the situation of the Banu Israel. In fact, the first place that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala went is to the heart of a woman. And I think these subtle points are so important when we come to consider kind of the roles of women in our contemporary communities that can be so very easily suppressed or overlooked. So that's one. I mean, there's so much more to say here. In the book, that's one way that I look at Quranic sacred history in this arc of prophetic families, from Adam and Hawa to our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In the second way that I'm reading the Quran is through aligning the revelatory order, meaning, the order from Mecca to Medina, as it's been pretty much well established by both academic scholars and people working from within our tradition itself. And so it's not a precise science, and some pieces of surahs came in different places, but on the whole, I map particular stories in Sirah with the corresponding stories that are coming in the Qur'an. And by doing this, we see not only how the stories play out in sacred history, but how this first generation of Muslims, and indeed potentially even the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was taking lessons from these stories. So that's another modality of reading. And for instance, if we read the Qur'an from that modality of reading, we see that when the family of Saleh, like I mentioned before, had to flee with Saleh, the family fled, we see very much a parallel to what happens then in the move from Mecca to Medina with the family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So oftentimes the stories foreshadow in very interesting ways. The stories that come in the Qur'an foreshadow events in the Sirah, in not only that instance, but in several others that I talk about in the book. The final way that actually so that's the arc of revelation, kind of as compared to the Sirah. And then we have the final compiled Qur'an, which also tells us a good deal about the placement of women's stories and the significance of women's stories in the Qur'an. And so whether we're looking very early on in Surah Al-Baqarah, which has that very first story of Adam and Hawa, or we're turning to the end of the Qur'an that has these verses on Abu Lahab's wife, we're seeing that from the very beginning to the very end of the actual Mus'haf, we're regularly running into women figures. And even though, for instance, at the verses on Abu Lahab Abu Lahab and his wife are at the end of the Qur'an, she's actually the first female figure to be mentioned in the arc of sacred history. And so we have, again, just as the story in Surah Al-Baqarah reminds us of this need to, not be arrogant as Shaitan was arrogant, the very first story of a woman figure also begins that lesson, do not be arrogant and humble yourself before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As we know from reading commentary traditions, it was not only the wife of Abu Lahab who was haughty and arrogant. Abu Lahab himself was haughty and arrogant. And so the Qur'an finishes in a way with the story of a couple, finishes in the Mus'haf with the story of a couple who are damned in no uncertain terms. But the Mus'haf, and as well, I should say, the arc of revelation too. This is a very early, Surah Abu Lahab is a very early, Surah Masad is a very early surah. But the Qur'an, when it's in its finalized form as the Mus'haf, starts with the story of Adam and Hawa, who also, they make a mistake. The Qur'an is pretty clear that they together made this mistake, but they also repent and move on. And so there's interesting juxtapositions that I talk about in the book between not only different couples, but between a figure like, for instance, Yusuf alayhi salam and Maryam alayhi salam, who at various points in their lives get stuck with a figure in their private chambers and react somewhat similarly, seeking refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that's basically, I'm going to kind of wrap it up so we have enough time for questions, and I'd love to hear the thoughts of the students. But yeah, thank you so much. There's so much more to say, but I encourage you to read the book, inshallah. And I'll put actually in the chat, Oxford University Press gave me a code for family and friends. So I consider you all my Princeton family. So I'll put that in the chat. And one of my requests in working with a publisher was that they kept the price of the book very low so that it could be very accessible to people. So I'm grateful to Oxford for making that happen. Yeah, so jazakumullah khair for listening, and I'll turn it over to the students.
Thank you so much, Dr. Celene, for that concise yet comprehensive overview of your work and your unique approach to this topic of women and gender in the Quran. And we definitely want to encourage everyone. Here's my copy. It's available at Barnes & Noble and many other places. So definitely we encourage you to purchase her book. And now I'm really looking forward to hearing from the students. And just a reminder, when the students are done, we will also open it up to the audience. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type it into the chat. So I'm going to bring into the conversation our student responders. Let me add. So we have 3. There she is. Okay. So we have with us Serene Junaid, who is a sophomore here at Princeton, and she's in the history department. We also have Raisa Chaudhry, who is a master's student first year in the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, concentrating in international development. And we also have Nariman Amin, who I can call Dr. Nariman now because she just, mashallah, successfully completed her PhD in January, and her PhD was in religion with a specialization in Islam. So perhaps we can start with seniority, and I'll call on Nariman first. And so this is just an immediate response, kind of reflection and a question for Dr. Celene. And after all 3 have gone, then I'll turn it back over to Dr. Celene for her response at the end. So Nariman.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim, for being here with us. It was such a pleasure to read your book as well. I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Sabrina, for the kind introduction. As an early career scholar, I have a few methodological questions, if I may. First, because you do talk about, this book showing your reverence for the Quran as someone who believes in its sacredness, but also you use scholarly language and your training to kind of speak to that audience as well. So my first question is, how are you able to balance both personas when you were researching and writing? And then relatedly, I was wondering if there was anything you had written that the publishers maybe thought was a little too personal or not quote unquote objective, and how you managed with that. And then finally, I wanted to ask you why you decided to stick only with the Quran and not look at, tafsir or the hadith tradition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nariman. I'm going to bring in Raisa now.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Ibrahim. Thank you so much for making time for us. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to read the whole book yet, but I'm really looking forward to reading it. As Nariman mentioned, I think it's always so exciting to have sources that are coming from people who do come from a place of generosity and reverence for Islam when they are kind of engaging in the scholarly work. And I thought it was really interesting how you talked about how you're hoping that this is not just a work of scholarship, but also something that is useful for the lay person and the lay Muslim, especially Muslim women who are kind of engaging in this tradition and trying to make sense of it when they think about gender and sexuality. And so I was wondering if you could talk about kind of specific areas that you think this could be really helpful for the lay person as they are just kind of navigating life, and things to look out for as we read it. And then sort of related to that, you spoke about how men and women in your study are not really spoken about in any significantly different ways in the Quran. And oftentimes I think the messaging I get is that men and women have very clearly delineated roles and they are distinct, and the Quran is where that comes from. And so I was curious if you could just kind of think of, or speak a little bit to how you are kind of thinking about those two things and how you're sort of reconciling them.
Thank you so much, Raisa. And last, I will call in Serene.
Salam, Dr. Ibrahim. Thank you so much for your time and discussing your amazing work on your book. And my reflections were on that. I also have studied a little bit of the Abrahamic faith traditions over my short time here at Princeton. And I've also come across what you mentioned in the beginning of your talk about how Islam is also often researched and studied in a sort of Eurocentric manner, and how your book aims to dismantle that a little bit or reverse that. And I thank you so much for your endeavors to add to Islamic scholarship in that way. But during your talk, I was finding myself thinking about attending Jummah on Fridays and listening to sermons of people, of the Imam talking about sexism in Islam in general, in Islamic culture in general. And oftentimes I find that the way that a lot of Muslims believe that the kind of answer to sexism is, you just simply mentioned during the bayan that, the first university was created by a Muslim woman, or Islam actually gave women the right to divorce, and then they just say these short facts, and then boom, sexism is solved, right? So my question is, how can we take the scholarship and the work that you've done in your book and pair that with other methods in, and what are the other methods in that we can pair with your work to help alleviate this problem that we have?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Serene. And I hope you got all of that, Dr. Celene. So you can begin in whatever order to respond to the questions.
Yeah, Jazakumullah khairan so much. I really appreciate those thoughtful questions. And Dr. Amin, congratulations. And I look forward to seeing your works on the shelf too, inshallah, in the future. The question of how to balance both personas, I actually spend a good part of the introduction having to reflect on this, not only because I had to reflect on it in the process of writing the book, but I knew that critics would kind of come at me from this particular dimension. I obviously, I'm a woman in a scarf. A lot of men who are Muslim writing in the academy can just not hide their Muslimness, but it's not as front and center. Anybody who is looking at me knows that I have a certain commitment to Islam. So I couldn't not address that perspective. And one of the things that feminist scholarship taught me, and I'm really grateful for a lot of the mentorship that I had, not at Princeton University per se, because actually most of the faculty in Islamic studies I studied with at that time were actually male faculty, with the exception of my Arabic teacher. I don't think and Dr. Shannon Marmon, I believe she's still teaching. So, my early mentors in Islamic studies were all men. And so it really required me learning a little bit more about how to situate one's own sociolocation as a sense, and to really use that rather than something to repress out of fear of being accused of being biased or the like. Rather, and it's right out there in my introduction, I start with this sense that, I have a lot at stake when I approach the Qur'an, not merely because I'm doing it as an academic, but because I'm doing it as a Muslim with a deep respect for the Qur'an, being considered the word of God, the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so I think for me, what has worked is using the strengths that I have in terms of being embedded not only in an intellectual tradition, but in Muslim communities, and letting that speak to my writing and to the issues that I'm working on. And a lot of the issues that I ended up addressing in the book, about women's speech or about women as spouses or the like, came out of conversations I was having in my role as a chaplain that I served in at Tufts University for a number of years. And so I wanted the book to be responsive to the types of intellectual concerns that actual women had. And I think that at its best, there's a way in which scholarship should be responsive to contemporary needs. And I particularly feel that, you know, as someone who has a tremendous privilege to be able to sit and write and think all day, that rather than ruminating on obscure points that don't necessarily affect people's lives, that I can use my time, inshallah, to benefit people. And that's really my, you know, constant dua, that my academic work is actually, you know, a benefit, and that supports people in their faith tradition. But at the same time, and when I'm writing a work that I hope uplifts women, I'm not going to, for instance, not talk about the fact that there are 3 women figures who are damned in the Qur'an. Like, there's no ideologically uniform kind of perception of who a woman is. Like, she can be damned to hell, you know, she can be Maryam alayhi salam, like we have this huge spectrum. And that's a lesson that I want to, Sister Risa, you had just asked, like, what is a lesson, or like, what is a really practical application of this? There's really, the Qur'an does not speak about this is the essential woman, this is the nature of womanhood at all. And I think we're sometimes stereotyped into being a particular way. The Qur'an gives us an example, for instance, of Bilqis, the Queen of Sheba, who is, you know, consulting her entourage about military matters, and who is very decisive in her. I mean, I bring her up because I know you're studying diplomacy. So, you know, here she is, the most skillful diplomat in the Qur'an, hands down, and she's a woman. So why do we have, you know, to get to some of your observations, why do we have such sexism when it comes to women having important roles in matters of politics or matters of you know, communal leadership that require that require a, you know, an approach to leadership that is kind of consensus building, but that is simultaneously decisive when it needs to be. And so this is the, yeah. So when I'm thinking about kind of who I am as a scholar, I'm not shying away from claiming the fact that I'm accountable to communities, that I see myself accountable to communities of practice. And so, you know, my scholarship is not only going to be, inshallah, reflective of those communities, but hopefully it'll help elevate them as well. And I think there's space in the academy, you know, as of the last maybe 5-10 years for this type of scholarship to happen. I think of the work, for instance, of a number of other scholars, not just writing in like Muslim theology, but actually writing in constructive Muslim theology or constructive Muslim studies. So scholarship can really be a way where we harness kind of the best of our tradition and the best of the Western intellectual tradition. So there's no, you know, we've never been as Muslims afraid of taking up new methods of learning and knowledge production. And there's no reason we should start being afraid now. Like we have a tremendous intellectual legacy, and part of that legacy is incorporating different, you know, methodologies for knowledge production. So yeah, that's basically how I'm situating myself. I have a piece coming out in the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion that talks even more about that question of bias and ways in which, when I found certain things in the Qur'an, like the fact that I mentioned here today, that actually we don't find women preaching, I can't, the scholar in me cannot kind of put that aside. You know, both the Muslim in me and the scholar in me have to really wrestle with what does that precisely mean. So, you know, it's always a work in progress. The other thing I'll just say about methods is that I very much see the scholarship as like an act of devotion, right? Like, so we can pray, we can read the Qur'an, but whatever our vocations are, inshallah, we can do them with a way that also becomes a way of like kind of growing in a spiritual sense. And so I just kind of, as a way of giving a piece of maybe unsolicited advice to everyone in the room who's trying to like choose a career and sort things out, you know, whatever you choose, whether you're like researching nanotechnology or, you know, whatever it is, tie it to your spiritual life so that work can become an act of ibadah, of worship as well, inshallah. Other areas, Risa, to your question about like how does this benefit the lay person, I really tease out in places like the Arabic of the Qur'an to show like what artistry it is contained, you know, in these stories. And I think sometimes because let me say this. We are not always taught Islamic intellectual history as young people with the same degree of sophistication as we're taught other subjects. And so we end up maybe with a not as deep of an appreciation of actually kind of the beautiful literary qualities of the Qur'an, or, you know, for instance, the deeply philosophical nature of some of the verses. And so unless we're in maybe a study group or something that's able to go deeply into that, there's not a whole lot of areas I find this, I'm raising a teenager, like a Muslim teenager, and I'm like, where do I send her to have like really deep philosophical discussions in the meaning of you know, of human life and purpose? It's hard to find those spaces. And so I kind of think of the work that I'm doing with the Qur'an as trying to help give people a door in so that they can see the sophistication and you know, see for themselves this tremendous layer of nuance and beauty in the Qur'an itself. In terms of distinct roles for men and women, now again, I'm working mainly in the realm of stories, and I did that very intentionally because a lot of my earlier work was on issues that involved more of the legal tradition, and I actually found that a little bit constraining, whereas in the realm of stories, you can pry much more. You know, for me personally, it was just, I like the literary, you know, that literary modality. And actually, most of the Qur'an is actually narratives of some kind or another. And this is the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us. And one thing that I do in the book is show how there are particular verses that contain a direct legal ruling, you know, do this, don't do that. But then very soon after in the arc of Revelation, you'll find a story that illustrates the moral of do this, don't do that. And what I think the stories do is give us part of the reasons of why should I not do that or do that? You know, we come from a really robust kind of intellectual tradition, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not only given us the rulings, but has given us examples, I call them in the book, case studies for like how a particular rule, you know, applies in practical contexts. And why I say that to preface what I'm about to say about men and women, we find the only differentiation when it comes to sort of thinking about categorically men and categorically women is around reproduction, right? We find, okay, rules for breastfeeding, naturally, they're going to apply in one way to men. You have to support a woman who's breastfeeding, and in another way to women, you know, breastfeed if you can, if you desire to, and get a wet nurse, you know, if you desire to. And so by the nature of the bodies that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us in, there are differences. I find that sometimes our intellectual history has taken what are essentially reproductive differences and then extended them to like mean all kinds of other things that are just, you don't find that in the Qur'an at all. What I mean is you don't find that in the Qur'an, meaning like most of the differentiations between roles for men and women are linked in some way to reproduction. So they're other than, so if you're going to locate like an essence of a woman, it's in the possibility, and of course not all women do procreate or can procreate, but it is in that sphere of carrying, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about in multiple verses, carrying this human being, right, in the womb. One of the other parallels I draw out in the book, and I think this is just so important to continue to underscore, is that Maryam alayhi salam gets, carries this burden of Isa, and I mean burden like as in the weight of Isa alayhi salam. And Isa alayhi salam is described as kalimatullah, the word of God, right? And so this is very powerful. Like she is going around giving, carrying the word of Allah, kalimatullah. And what is kalimatullah? Kalimatullah is also like the Qur'an. It's also revelation itself. So we cannot underplay downplay, the importance of what women are contributing to, this sense of sacred power. And just to underscore that, qara'a in the Arabic language, that comes from Qur'an. Actually, one of the meanings of qara'a, that root, is to be or become pregnant. This is an old meaning. It's not too much used in contemporary Arabic, but that same parallel that we find with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calling Isa kalimatullah, we actually find in this idea of the Qur'an itself, and going back to a root that also means to be pregnant. So there's a lot of subtleties that need to be pulled out, and this is part of why, to get to your point about Sister Celene, like what do we do about the sexism? We just have to keep writing. I get a lot of sexist remarks whenever I do lectures, not from the people in the lectures, but if anything gets uploaded onto YouTube, oh my God. There's a certain resilience that one has to show, particularly as a woman scholar. And and I just, I pray for strength for all of us who are having to be women in the world. And there's a lot of people who do want to elevate women's voices and are very keen on correcting what is in some ways an exclusion of women's voices, particularly in certain areas of Islamic intellectual production. So I've learned to laugh at sexist comments and not kind of take them personally, but I do use them as motivation for, continuing to push myself. I talked in the beginning how I see myself as a tentative mufassira, and one of my scholar colleagues asked me, what would help me stop being tentative? And, part of that, the defining virtue of Islam is in many ways humility. So that's, I don't think I'll ever not be tentative about it, but, continuing as a young Muslim in the ways that I'm young to, continue to dig into this tradition in a very determined way. So I take the sexism, to answer your question directly. Every time I get sexism, in my own life, I just channel it into determination to excel, inshallah, with bidnillah. So, and about the sexism, don't get angry, because anger just is not necessarily a good use of emotional energy. Channel it into determination, inshallah, and that'll take you further than anger will. Although I think we have lots of rights to be angry about certain things. Women, there was a question in the chat about women and men speaking. And I actually, while I've isolated all the ayat, I think I've isolated all the ayats with women speaking, and I analyzed them in one chapter of the book. I still have to do that with the male lines of speech. And so I'm going to hold off answering that particular question. But I will say that women pray a whole lot in the Qur'an, and that's also kind of anecdotally what I know about male speech as well, that we have many, many prayers to women from male figures as well. I think, and this is just my hunch before doing the systematic research, is that actually there's more lines of arrogant speech when it comes to male figures. I'm just thinking of like Surah Al-Kahf and some others, but we do find beautiful illustrations of, for instance, father-son relationships, just like we find beautiful father-daughter relationships in the Quran, or mother-daughter relationships. So yeah, there's a lot more to do in this angle of research. So I'll have to get back to you, inshallah, in a few years.
Thank you so much, Dr. Celene, and thank you so much to all of our brilliant students for your reflections and questions. So we do have a few questions from the audience, and I'll turn it over to some of those questions now. There was one that I got before we started, and it's a little lengthy, but I think the whole thing is important for the context of the question. So recently, I found myself in a painful spiritual situation that I never expected. My spiritual teacher made a literal description of Jannah, with all men having multiple wives and hurain, both of which the men can and will impregnate. And it triggered me into a deep spiritual crisis where I ended up with some very negative thinking about the nature of my creation. I'm created to be a co-wife. My soul is not as complete as a man's. I have no choice in this matter. I even thought absurd things like, should I divorce my husband now because I'd rather be alone in the afterlife than a co-wife? In other words, having given this description of the afterlife turned my heaven into hell, and it almost devoured me. I'm a serious-minded Muslim. This never triggered me before because I understood the descriptions of Jannah as contextual, yet here I was receiving this information from a very reputable scholar. Would you please share what you have discovered about this matter? In my year-long search for answers, I discovered that I'm not alone among women who are troubled by the interpretation of multiple wives and hurain in Jannah. It causes us to question our faith, our scholars, and the meaning of our existence. And as part of this question, do you think there's something especially valuable about polygamy for women? Do you think it's a woman's true nature to be in that relationship over monogamy? Currently, I believe women can be very different in their preference in marital arrangements. And I see Sayyidah Fatima radiallahu anha as an example in that.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair for that question. And inshallah, Allah puts these struggles in our life, I think, like these intellectual struggles as well, so that we really can sink into the meanings and keep questioning. And I find that for me personally, questioning on a deep level is actually part of my spirituality. So I for all people who do find themselves like questioning certain aspects, this is a reason where there's a religion where you do tadabbur, and you do tafakkur, and you think, and you really contemplate things. And part of there's a few ways I'm going to answer the question directly, but I think part of what you're speaking to as well is the need to have more women teachers who understand kind of from a experiential perspective how certain language could affect our spiritual states and our psychology. And what I do in the book, I address this question very directly in the chapter on sexuality. And it's the argument is multi-layered. And so I'd really urge, whoever question this was, do look at what I do with this in the book. And it's been fairly well received. But what I say is essentially, let's look at what the Qur'an actually says about this matter. And I don't go into hadith. I'm not a hadith scholar yet. I don't know, that looks like an area that I'll have to at some point write on. But if we look at what the Qur'an says, when it never uses the word woman for beings in paradise. And what I argue is that this term wildan, which is the like walad, wildan is one of the plurals of walad. And if we're thinking about Arabic as a language, non-human entities, when they're in the plural, I mean, follow me here. That's why I said read the book, but follow me here for a sec. Non-human entities, when they're in the plural, get feminine descriptors, right? They're considered grammatically feminine, even if they're not ontologically female. And at the same time, for other groups, the collective masculine, grammatical masculine, encompasses women or female beings as well. So these are two features of Arabic language that we have to keep in mind when we read the Qur'an. And a lot, so there's one of my subtitles in the book is "There are no women in paradise," right? Or something to that effect. And that's actually the case. We never find the Qur'an speaking about women in the same ways that it speaks about human women. And so what I say is that when the Qur'an is talking about souls in like nafs, individuals, in spirits, you might say, in the hereafter, it's speaking about the nafs, which is gendered feminine. So whereas people would kind of isolate the hur as being feminine and kind of let their imagination go wild about what that means. And we have a lot of wildly imaginative works in Islamic intellectual history about the hur, all of them. And I categorically say all of them because I've looked pretty systematically, all of them written by men. And so we really do not have much literature thinking about the afterlife, and specifically about the idea of sexual pleasure in the afterlife, that are written from a female perspective. And this is what I try to do in the book is to show how, whereas in some of the Quranic descriptions about food in Jannah, there's very specific verses that say you will eat from the food. One of the arguments that I make is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala nowhere in the Quran mentions sex in paradise as being explicitly promised. So I find that really intriguing, because when I was writing earlier iterations of this book, people would say to me, well, that's just the Quran being modest about the affair and that, like, the matter. And I actually pointed to lots of places in the Quran where sex and sexuality is talked about in very direct ways. So I don't think that there would need to be other reasoning for why, for instance, the Quran says all of these fruits from which you shall eat, you being or from which the people in paradise shall eat. But then when it comes to sex in paradise, there's no explicit, there's allusions of reclining on couches, or some would call them beds, or, but really there's only allusions. And part of the, so much of our tradition of depicting the afterlife is, not necessarily sound, like when it comes to exactly what the Quran has said. So, and again, I have to do much more digging in hadith to understand which are reliable hadith and what we can understand from them. But yeah, go read my book on those verses, and inshallah, I think you'll find that helpful. I personally found that very helpful. And the idea, there's one last piece of that question. I know we're getting towards time, but this is a rather important point. For a long time, I looked at verses on, allowing multiple spouses for men and only a single spouse for a woman. And I thought about, fairness and justice and egalitarianism and questions of that nature. And then what I started to see in my actual life in the world as a Muslim is that women were just ready for marriage a lot sooner than many of the men. And I still know many, many women who would like to get married, may Allah facilitate the affair for them, and have a really difficult time finding spouses who are kind of reliable and who treat them well, and all of this. And for some women, I know that they would much rather like to get married than to spend time, like to spend a life without a spouse. And so on the same time, you find different times in history and different, individual cases where you do find, for various reasons, a dearth of responsible men. And, we have the power and the capacity as women to write into our marriage contracts all kinds of things, including that we would need to approve of our spouse taking a second spouse. And so I think I encourage people for whom you're absolutely certain that a monogamous relationship is exactly what you want. You can write that into your contract, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the ability to write that in. On the other hand, there are some women for whom their circumstances require that they might be in a marriage where their partner has multiple other spouses. And in that case, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written the requirement of justice onto the man. And so we have to understand this in a social context. And if a man exploits this kind of permission, then that's really on him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees. And I just pray that we have more men in our communities who are willing to step up and take responsibility for a family, as daunting as that probably is. We see in our contemporary world that men aren't really interested in getting married, some of them, until they're in their 40s or 50s, and women are interested in getting married, what I've seen, a lot sooner than that. So, may Allah support us in finding good spouses, that will uplift us in the path of Islam, that will respect our rights, that, will make us better Muslims. And yeah, thank you for that question. Feel free to reach out to me privately as well, whoever asked that question.
I mean, there was just one follow-up question on that point of the description of Jannah. Do you understand that as literal or metaphorical, or for the people who received it first?
Yeah. So I think this is one of the beauties of the Qur'an, that so much of the language can either be read literal or can be read metaphorically. And what I say is that Jannah by its very nature can't possibly disappoint. The whole purpose of Jannah is that it is a realm where people are completely and wholly at peace. And so, if we just take that description, it actually really doesn't matter. If it's helpful for somebody in their spiritual life to be able to say, I'm going to be able to enjoy sexual relations in paradise, if that's a motivating factor, good for you. Whatever helps you on this earth, inshallah, be a good Muslim. Yeah, go for it. And, on the other hand, I think if it's a point of pain or a point of distraction or a point of kind of shak, of doubt, then it's not so fundamental to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has laid out. If it was fundamental, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have said it more directly and did not explicitly promise sexual relations in paradise. So at least, not in the Qur'an, not context of the Qur'an. So either way, I think people can use, focus on the things as just a general, maybe life lesson. It's Islam is meant to cater to a lot of different types of people. So, know yourself and know what's motivating for you and what's a roadblock, and choose what's, embrace those things, contemplate on those things that take you to a higher state, but don't hesitate to ask questions too. We're an intellectual tradition, and I think the more we embrace that, the better on the firmer grounding will be, inshallah.
Thank you so much. There were a couple questions related to your work and feminism. So one of the questions was, have you ever engaged with the scholarship of any contemporary feminist Muslim scholars to complete this project? And the other question was, as someone that hasn't engaged in feminism or Islamic feminism academic works, would this book require prior knowledge of those fields to gain from the book?
Yeah, I thought very carefully about how I laid out the work to make it extremely accessible to people who were not necessarily embedded in an academic discourse of whether of Quranic studies or of kind of women's studies in Islam from an academic perspective. And essentially, I put in the footnotes a lot of the scholarly work so that I could keep the prose itself very, hopefully, inshallah, very easy to engage with. So the book, if you're a scholar in the field, then a lot of what I'm doing and a lot of the previous work that I'm citing is actually kind of, there's a dialogue going on in the footnotes, and they're really rich in that regard. The publisher told me to cut them down. I cut them down as much as I could, but I was able to preserve a lot of that in the footnotes. So no, the book itself reads really clearly. I think that was one of my goals in writing it. And so inshallah, it reads clearly like that. But I'm building a legacy of women scholars in the academy specifically. And I think as I'm looking and seeing kind of who's coming through the pipeline as well, there are so many really strong women scholars. And my shelf is just, may Allah bless my husband, he had to keep expanding it for me because there's just more and more and more great literature that's out there. And I almost can't read it as fast as it's being published. So alhamdulillah, we're in a really fertile time for scholarship, for women's scholarship specifically, but for Islamic studies across the board. So, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put tremendous barakah in I think in this merger between Islamic studies and the Islamic intellectual heritage.
Thank you so much. I know we're almost at time. Just one more question. We got a bunch of questions about sexual orientation and whether your book touches on it. I don't think it did, unless I missed something, but was there anything you wanted to say about sexual orientation as it relates to women and gender in the Quran?
Yeah, I got asked that after the book was published. I didn't take it up in the book because there are really no stories involving women figures that relate to the topic of same-sex attraction. I do discuss in the book the daughters of Lut a little bit, so I touch on that story for those of you who are curious about how I see that story from kind of a female-centric lens. And in the piece coming out in the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion, I think a little bit more deeply on this question of what the Quran has to say in general about same-sex relations. And I find that in the contemporary way that we understand gender as being to some degree disassociated with biological sex, very much in the Quran, at least the way I see it, is that there's a pretty direct mapping from untha, like female, to like woman or wife or nisa, imra, these terms that mean, that are gendered terms. And so the Quran does not depict gender in the way that contemporary feminist scholars depict the difference between biological sex and gender. There's a real collapse. And in the way that the Quran talks about a zawj as being a pair that is linked to reproduction, it doesn't see, like, we don't see any passages in the Quran where zawj is a same-sex pairing. It's always situated in the discourse on mating, and zawj in itself can mean, like, one translation of that is mate, and so the Quran is not really addressing, when it comes to female sexuality, at least, it doesn't have any female figures that have a desire for other female figures. It doesn't have, even with male figures, the male figures in the Qur'an, in the story of Lut, they're actually feeling attraction to angelic beings that happen to be in the form of men. So one of the distinctions I make is that the Qur'an does not share any stories that I saw of like human beings of one sex or one gender having desire for other human beings of that same sex or of that same gender. And so it's not really a topic that is so robustly addressed in terms of what the Qur'an is doing in the realm of stories. There's a question in the chat about the article, Journals and Feminist Studies of Religion. We submitted it like 2 weeks ago. There's several other scholars who reflected on the book, and then I responded to them, and yeah, so keep an eye out. I think it should be in the next issue, in the spring issue. Inshallah, we'll see when. But yeah, I think it's a contemporary issue we have to really think about carefully. We understand sexuality and gender very differently than I think is depicted, at least in the Qur'an. So I don't know, in terms of thinking through how we are in community with all different kinds of Muslims, with all different sorts of sexualities and gender identities. I don't know that the Qur'an itself is like the most robust source for that. I think we're going to have to turn to other sources for understanding like this particular contemporary question.
Thank you so much. I want to be mindful of your time. There is one participant who has his hand raised. Do we have time for one last question?
Sure.
Okay.
Brother Saleh, is that?
Yes, asked to unmute. Let me bring you in.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, the question was in the chat box, but I think it got lost among many others. So I worked on Ottoman political thought in my PhD dissertation at Georgetown, and the Ottoman thinkers, who were all trained in classical Islamic sciences, had very negative views of the woman's involvement in politics. They saw this as one of the root causes of Ottoman decline, quote unquote. And you mentioned how Muslim scholars of the past grew up memorizing Qur'an and how they knew it much more than you. And how come Muslim scholars of the past, with such a solid knowledge of Qur'an, got it so wrong about women for so long? And how should modern Muslim male scholars like me approach these Muslim men of the past? Actually, my approach was just totally ignoring those views and focusing on other ideas, but I'm asking your opinion.
I love this question. Mashallah, mashallah, mashallah. What I'll say is that women have tremendous like power and acumen, and quite frankly, the men who are empowered just don't like that competition. It's the same way that the odds are stacked against women when it comes to marriage, right? Like our classical scholars really made it difficult for women to marry anyone other than a Muslim man, while they were very, very, very lenient on, Muslim men being able to, like, any monotheist. If she's monotheist, great. So there's certain ways, in which I think if you like kind of reduce the competition, and I know you're an Ottoman scholar, so I think so many of the the concubines who were in the palaces actually wielded a tremendous amount of power, and the men had to be not only wary of their other male contributor or contestants kind of in line for the throne, but they also had to watch what all their concubines were doing kind of, between ruling directly or lining up their sons for rule. And so I think it's just a case, and I have to respect the legacy of scholarship, but I think sometimes people act very pragmatically in their own self-interests. And if you're, if you delegitimate half of the population to be able to hold political power, it's more of a strategic move, I think, than a wholly religious one. The other thing I'll say is that we do find in the tradition men who really held women scholars in such high esteem. And we find that when men had women scholars who they learned from, they were much more respectful. And I don't think anybody has done like a systematic study of this to show it. I just know it anecdotally from kind of reading, my own reading. But a lot of times we think based on what we're exposed to. And if we've systematically sidelined women scholars from so many fields, well, then it's very easy to say, well, what do women have to contribute to this field? It's that kind of chicken and egg sort of question. But I'm really heartened by kind of the contemporary period. And I think that there are very kind of not only in terms of women with great potential, but also, men who are willing to highlight the voices of women scholars or women diplomats or politicians, or, across all fields of knowledge and, social engagement. So yeah, thank you so much for the question. And I think it's one that we need to continue to ask over and over again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Celene. So with that, I'm gonna close this now. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Celene, for this conversation and for your scholarship. May Allah continue to bless you and in all that you do. And I'm looking forward to your forthcoming publications, inshallah, particularly the men and gender in the Qur'an one. And I want to thank all the student responders for their brilliant responses and questions. And of course, I want to thank Imam Sohaib, whose idea and vision was behind this event, and continue to keep him and his family in your prayers. And thank you all for coming out and engaging. We'd love to keep in touch. I'm going to put a link in the chat, which will be to join our email list. And this actually will be on YouTube, but we'll turn off the comments to keep away the trolls, inshallah. YouTube.com/Muslim Life Program. And I think those are all the links, yes. So yeah, I hope to see you all soon. Please keep in touch. And thank you again, Dr. Celene. May God bless you and God bless all of you.
Jazakallah khair, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase us all in knowledge, and if we've made any mistakes, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows us our mistakes such that we could correct them. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and all of the work that the program is doing. Inshallah, it's Imam Sultan was my chaplain when I was a senior at Princeton. He had just started, so inshallah, I just pray again for his healing and continued ability to benefit this community, inshallah.
Ameen, ameen, ameen. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum salam.